We're here with Mr. Glenn Garrels. He was a former lieutenant in the New Jersey State Police. He now works for his own company called Force Analysis LLC, does consulting and expert witness work on use of force and police-involved shootings. Glenn, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Good afternoon. Glad to be here. Like I said, 22 years in the state police, just retired about a year and a half ago. Did about 5 years as a road trooper down South Jersey, Troop A. Made detective, investigating crimes against children in the Digital Technology Investigation Unit. Did that for about 9 months, and then moved on over to the Major Crime Unit, where I spent my next almost 14 years of my career, investigating homicides, suspicious deaths, and officer-involved shootings / in-custody deaths. And then my last 3 years I spent down the Casino Gaming Bureau in Atlantic City.
So I guess the main bulk of your career was spent in major crimes.
Correct, yes.
Yeah. Tell us a little more about your time in major crimes. Like, what exactly did you do there, and what types of cases did you investigate?
So we did suspicious deaths. I know my squad, we probably did about 40 to 50 suspicious deaths a year. We did the homicides, and that can range, anywhere between 5 to 10 homicides a year. And then we did all the deadly force shootings and in-custody deaths around the state. And that could be anywhere between, 5 and 15 cases a year. It was an enormous amount of work, but I'll tell you what, you couldn't ask for a better, not only time in major crimes, but my whole career, man. I loved it. It was fantastic, especially that major crime time. That really, you want to be a detective, you join something like that, and you're involved in some of the biggest cases in the state going on. So it was very fulfilling.
Yeah, I mean, you're on call as well, I imagine.
All the time, 24/7.
Yeah, it never stops, right? So use of force. During your time in the state police, tell us a little more about, what your involvement was in reviewing use of force and maybe developing policies and different things like that.
So in my time in major crime, we just did, we investigated the officer-involved shootings. We weren't involved in the policy. We weren't involved whether if there was justification or not for the deadly force. We strictly did the investigation. I started out as the junior detective, worked my way up to the lieutenant in the unit. So, being the low man on the pole, trying to do most of the investigative work, to the person running and supervising the case. It could be anywhere between, 10 to 15, 10, 20 detectives all kind of running around simultaneously to the person running the unit and overseeing.
Gotcha. And what were you like when you did the officer-involved shooting investigations? Like, was there a certain procedure that they had to follow and they used force that you had to keep in mind during the investigation?
Well, it certainly helps, because for you to do interviews of officers involved, whether they're witnesses or the person's even the ones using deadly force, you have to know the policy. You have to know force to better tailor your questions to get the information out of the officers. Because I'm not going to try to say that I know the stress of being involved in a shooting. I never was, thank God. So I can't imagine what an officer is going through mentally and psychologically when he's involved in something like that. Basically their career and life is on the line at that point, But for you to understand the policy and the standard and the case law behind it just helps you formulate your questions to get the information out of the officers so they can articulate what they did and why they did it.
And what are the standards for the use of force? Like let me back up a second. Is the standard for use of force, is it the Attorney General guidelines that set the standard for the entire state, or does each police department have their own use of force standard?
Well, in New Jersey, they have the Attorney General guidelines that rules the roost. All the police departments have to be in line with what they have. Now, there's the federal standard of Graham versus Connor, which every state has to have the minimum objective reasonableness, but then states can make their policies and guidelines stricter, which
Sure.
New Jersey has a little bit, especially with the new policies that came out a couple of years ago. But so their standard is basically a reasonable, necessary, and proportional, regardless of what the force option you're using.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that standard for people watching this who may not know, anything at all about what exactly the guideline is or the policy is?
Well, if you start with Graham versus Connor, which is the federal standard of force under the case law, Objective reasonableness, they couldn't give a definition, but they understand that officers have to make split-second judgments under circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving about the amount of force used in each particular case. And it's what the officer knew at the time on scene, not the vision of 2020 hindsight, all based on the totality of the circumstances. And then they give the 4 Graham factors that you kind of go through to kind of analyze the force, which is the severity of the crime, the immediacy of the threat, whether the person is resisting, and whether they're evading by flight. That's the Graham standard in a nutshell. It's a little bit more complicated than that,
Sure.
but that's the breakdown of it. And then the Attorney General's guidelines for reasonableness is basically an objective assessment based on someone with similar training and experience. Would they have done the same thing in your situation?
Right. So it's very similar to sort of maybe the reasonable suspicion standard for making an investigative stop or something like that. It seems to be grounded in the same sort of general principles of, what is a reasonable person? What would a reasonable officer do in the situation? Is that fair to say?
Yes, and they have to be able to articulate it for
Sure.
each particular incident. You can't use like a boilerplate type incident. Every use of force, whether it's deadly or mechanical or physical, whatever you use it, you have to articulate and explain what you did and why you did it. Especially in
Right.
today's day and age, it's not 1980 anymore, where police officers are kind of allowed to run kind of wild. There's strict guidelines now, and you have to be prepared to answer those tough questions when you're asked, whether it's an internal investigation from your own department, whether it's a criminal case against you, or whether it's a civil case down the road.
And the procedure that an officer, the procedure that an officer has to abide by, where, if there's some sort of shooting incident that they're involved in, regardless of how obvious it may be that, force was necessary, could be someone clearly had a gun, was firing back at the officers, and then they returned fire and he was shot or killed. Even in that situation, the same strict procedures are put into place as far as the investigative steps and the things that the officer has to do to ensure that he keeps his job, right?
100%. Again, I'm not going to try to sit here and tell you that I know what it's like to be involved in deadly force. I never was, thank God. But I have seen the officers that have been involved in those shootings, and I sat across the table and interviewed them for their cases, and the emotional and psychological stress that they go through from the time that happens, probably for the rest of their lives, if not at least their careers, of having that hanging over their head, whether they shot and hit someone or not, or whether they shot and killed them. It's unbelievable the amount of stress and pressure that they're under, and you can tell some of them never get over it. Some of them retire shortly after the incident due to the emotional stress caused by that. Some, still stay working, but you can tell sometimes they're not the same person anymore.
And I mean, all of these investigations, they're not just IA investigations. They're all, is it fair to say, they're all treated as criminal investigations, potentially?
I mean, ours, when we're doing it in major crimes, ours was basically a criminal investigation.
Right. And in New Jersey, if I'm not mistaken, in New Jersey, every single officer involved shooting has to be presented to a grand jury, regardless of whether or not the prosecutor assesses that this is self-defense or this was justified. That has to be presented to the grand jury in the most up-to-date law that's been passed in recent years.
I think if it's only if it's a deadly.
If it's a death, yeah, I think you're
That's
right.
definite, yes.
If it's deadly, even if the prosecutor in reviewing everything says, I don't believe this is, a criminal homicide, I believe that this is, covered by self-defense or other justification. Even if the prosecutor feels that way, they have to present it to the grand jury.
Correct.
And right. And did that, when that went into effect, were you still working in major crimes?
I was, but it was at the tail end. In
And
years prior, the director of criminal justice could just sign off if he
right.
felt there was no issues, or the attorney general would say, it was justified or not. But now,
In
yeah,
your
no, it's really strict now.
in your brief time at the tail end when they changed that, like, was there for lack of a better term, was there like a culture shift in everything? Because I mean, obviously, it puts the final decision in the hands of 12 random people instead of someone in within the system that makes these decisions day to day. How did that change impact your unit and even the people you investigated? Like, what, like, can you describe anything in that area?
Well, you could definitely feel the difference because it was more pressure on us now, and it wasn't meant to um, get the officer cleared. It was just making sure that we had everything done investigatively to make sure that whoever the trier of fact is to decide, it was based on the totality of the circumstances, that we did everything that we could have done investigatively. Because I'll tell you what, when we did police-involved shootings, we leave no stone left unturned. I mean, we
Right.
do absolutely everything we can to gather the facts. And that's all our job is. Our job was not for us to provide our opinions on whether we felt the deadly force was justified or not. That's not what a detective's job is, whether you're handling police shootings or burglaries or sexual assaults. Your job is to gather the facts. And that's what we did to the best of our possible ability that we could do that. And I think we were the best at doing
And has there been an increase in the number of officers prosecuted since that new law, since they have to be presented to the grand jury instead of, you know, those decisions being made by, people in the attorney general's office?
that. I've certainly seen definitely police officers getting charged in the last couple of years. Um, I didn't know everything about the case, so I can't tell you if I thought the case was justified or not because I wasn't handling the investigation. I didn't know the totality of the circumstances.
Right.
Um,